President Trump ratcheting up the tariff war with a measure that could be another big blow to Canada. Donald Trump announced a 50% tariff on copper.
Today we're doing copper.
Copper, what would that tariff be on? The sectional tariff?
I believe the tariff on copper, we're going to make it 50%.
In a single day, President Donald Trump's decision to slap a 50% tariff on copper imports, announced during a cabinet meeting in Washington, sent shockwaves through the U.S. economy. The move, set to kick in on August 1, 2025, wasn't just a policy tweak, it was a bombshell. Within 24 hours of the order, the U.S. hemorrhaged $42 billion as markets reeled. Copper prices on the Comex exchange spiked 13% overnight, soaring to a record $5.95 per pound. Canada, which supplies over 40% of America's refined copper, didn't sit quietly. Ottawa froze all export contracts, and heavyweights like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals halted shipments to the U.S. market. Canada's government made it clear they're done relying on a trade partner that flips the rules on a whim. The fallout was instant. U.S. electronics, construction, and auto industries plunged into a supply crisis not seen in decades. Copper, the unsung hero in every wire, circuit, and engine, is now the spark of a full-blown trade war. Americans are feeling it in everything, from their cars to their light bulbs. The big question now is, how does the U.S. climb out of this mess when its own tariffs are strangling its industries? Stick with us as we unpack this video, and don't forget to hit subscribe and that notification bell to stay in the loop. When Trump invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, branding copper a national security priority, the 50% tariff on all imported copper became official for August 1, 2025. This wasn't a small pivot. It was a sledgehammer to a critical artery of U.S. industry. The reaction was swift. Comex copper futures jumped 13% in a single session, hitting 5.64 to 5.69 per pound, while London Metal Exchange prices actually dipped slightly, spooked by fears of a U.S. demand drop. This created a wild price gap. U.S. copper suddenly cost up to 25% more than global markets, opening an arbitrage window that exposed the cracks in Trump's protectionist gamble. Canada didn't hesitate. Supplying over half its copper exports to the U.S. in 2023, Ottawa declared it would pivot to Asia and Europe, rerouting trade to dodge America's unpredictable tariffs. Mining giants like Glencore and Quebec started eyeing new markets, a move that wasn't just symbolic, it was a calculated gut punch. Analysts are sounding alarms. This price split could isolate the U.S. economy, echoing the 1930s when protectionist policies froze global trade. With copper prices spiking, industries like autos, energy, and telecom face soaring costs, risking inflation and stalled production. The U.S. produces just over half its copper needs and imported 810,000 tons in 2024, mostly from Canada, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. Domestic refining is stretched thin. Plants like ASARCO in Arizona are shuttered, unable to fill the gap. Instead of solving supply issues, the tariffs jacking up prices, choking availability, and inviting long-term chaos. Canada's response wasn't just a reflex, it was a masterstroke. With $9.3 billion in annual copper exports, mostly to the U.S., Canada held serious leverage. Days after Trump's tariff hit, companies like Teck Resources and Hudbay Minerals, with Glencore in tow, shifted gears. They stopped shipping to the U.S. and turned to Japan, South Korea, and China, redirecting raw copper for refining abroad. This wasn't just a detour, it cut the U.S. out of the refined copper supply chain entirely. Ottawa backed this up with a $1.8 billion CAD investment to boost export infrastructure, aiming to make Canada a global metals player, not just a U.S. supplier. This is a seismic shift. Canada's not just rerouting trade, it's rewriting its role in the global market, betting on Asia to reduce its vulnerability to U.S. tariff swings. If this plan holds, Canada's export capacity could surge, slashing America's share of its copper trade. The U.S. faces a grim ripple effect, refining plants starved of raw material, higher production costs, and pricier goods. From power bills to electric vehicles, American consumers will feel the pinch. Canada's no longer just a neighbor. It's a rival steering the global copper game, leaving the U.S., which banked on self-reliance, scrambling without the refining muscle to back it up. The tariff didn't just spark Canada's countermove, it threw U.S. businesses into a tailspin and hit consumers right in their wallets. Electric vehicles, which guzzle about 80 kilojoules of copper for wiring and motors, saw production costs climb by roughly 90 per vehicle, per industry estimates. That's not a blip, it's a multi-million-dollar hit for companies like Tesla and Ford, who've already paused EV projects as copper shortages bite. In places like Ohio and Indiana, small manufacturers of wiring and electronics are in chaos, with imported copper wire prices up 18%, costing them contracts to cheaper suppliers in Vietnam and Thailand. Utility companies are reeling too, with copper-based conductors and transformer cores jumping 2 to 5% in cost, prompting emergency rate hike requests. A UBS report warns this could shave 0.5% off U.S. GDP this quarter alone, with $42 billion in losses tied directly to Canada's export freeze. Construction's hurting as insulation material prices soar. The EV sector's stalling from supply delays, and energy firms are hiking prices to stay afloat. The pain's clear: higher utility bills, pricier home repairs, and costlier cars, all driven by copper's new price tag. Experts warn that American businesses are burning through old copper stocks to keep costs down, but once those run dry, the real price spikes will hit consumers hard. This isn't just about copper, it's about a policy that's unraveling U.S. industry. The U.S. industry imported 53% of its copper in 2024, leaning heavily on Canada and Chile, but its domestic refining can only handle about 5% of demand. The tariffs tightened an already strained market, driving costs skyward and risking instability. General Motors reported a $1.1 billion loss from earlier tariffs, and now the copper hits piling on. Telecom, renewable energy, and electronics firms are slashing margins, delaying investments, or facing layoffs if this drags on. The Financial Times notes that once legacy copper inventories vanish, businesses can't hide the costs anymore. Those will land squarely on consumers. From power grids to EV chargers, copper's reach is everywhere, and so is the damage. The US bet on tariffs to boost itself, but instead, it sparked a supply chain crisis. Canada's pivot to Asia isn't just a trade reroute, it's a power shift, stripping the US of control over a metal it's leaned on for decades. The fallout's hitting everyday Americans hardest. Electric vehicle prices are up $3,000 to $6,000, and building a new home could cost $17,000 to $22,000 more, all tied to copper's surge. From light bulbs to wiring to charging stations, copper's fingerprints are on everything, and now so are higher prices. Trump pitched tariffs as a path to self-reliance, but the US lacks the refining capacity to make it work. Instead of integration with global markets, the US chose a walled-off approach, and it's backfiring with volatility and uncertainty. Is this the economic win Trump promised, or a self-inflicted wound that's pushing America out of the global trade loop? Canada's not just reacting, it's redefining the copper trade, positioning itself as a strategic player while the US grapples with shortages and costs. The $4.2 billion shock is just the start. What's next in this new trade era where America's no longer calling the shots? Drop your thoughts below and subscribe